Welcome back to Emma's Stories, the place where love comes to life in every tale we tell. If you're new here, I'm so glad you've joined us. This is a channel for dreamers, for romantics, for anyone who believes that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that might just steal your heart. Today, we're diving into a romance that will take you from the dazzling lights of New York City to the golden shores of Los Angeles. It's a story about Ethan Carter, a brilliant but guarded CEO of Carter Designs, a man who built an empire from ashes but locked his heart away after a betrayal cut him too deep. And then there's Mia Lawson, a mystery wrapped in a worn denim jacket, a woman with bright eyes and a quiet strength that could unravel even the coldest soul. What begins as a business deal, a marriage forced by a dusty old contract, turns into a love story neither of them saw coming. Imagine this, a man who swore he'd never trust again, standing on the edge of losing everything he's worked for, a woman who steps into his world not with glamour or greed, but with a sketchbook and a promise. Their journey starts with a single look, a fleeting touch, and a question that lingers in the air. Can love grow where doubt has taken root? Can two broken hearts find a way to heal each other? This isn't just a story about fashion or power, though you'll feel the pulse of New York's runways and the tension of a corporate empire at stake. It's about the moments that matter, the late nights over coffee, the brush of hands under a desk lamp, the way a simple red rose can say more than words ever could. It's about a man learning to let go of his past, and a woman finding her home in the one place she never expected. So, grab a cozy blanket, maybe a cup of tea, and settle in. We're about to follow Ethan and Mia through a romance that defies the odds, a love that turns a cold contract into a bond that lasts forever. Will they overcome the shadows of betrayal? Will they find the courage to choose each other? Stick with me, because this is one story you won't want to miss. Let's step into the night under New York lights, where it all begins. The city of New York never sleeps, and on this particular night it was alive with a restless energy. The skyline glittered like a constellation of fallen stars, skyscrapers piercing the dark with their golden glow. Down below, the streets buzzed with the chaos of Fashion Week, taxis honking, crowds spilling out of trendy bars, the faint hum of excitement rippling through the air. In the heart of it all stood the flagship showroom of Carter Designs, a sleek glass tower rising above Fifth Avenue. Inside, Ethan Carter leaned against the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored black suit, his sharp green eyes tracing the city below. At 34, Ethan was a name everyone in fashion knew. The CEO of Carter Designs, he'd turned a crumbling family business into a powerhouse of luxury after his father's death 7 years ago. But success came with a price. The man staring out at New York tonight wasn't the dreamer who'd once sketched designs by hand, fueled by passion and hope. That Ethan had died the day Olivia Hayes, his first love, stole his spring collection and sold it to a rival. The betrayal didn't just break his heart, it shattered his trust, and when his father suffered a stroke from the shock of the scandal, passing away weeks later, Ethan buried whatever was left of his softer self. He rebuilt Carter Designs with steel and grit, vowing never to let anyone close again. Tonight, though, his mind wasn't on the runways or the new collection set to debut. It was on a piece of paper sitting on his desk, its edges worn from years of being ignored. He stepped away from the window, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and picked it up. The shareholder contract his father had written before he died. Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the bolded clause for the 100th time. Ethan James Carter must marry before his 35th birthday to retain ownership of 51% of Carter Designs. Failure to comply will transfer his shares to existing shareholders based on their current stakes. His birthday was 3 weeks away, 3 weeks to find a wife, or lose everything to Olivia, who'd wormed her way onto the board after the scandal, waiting for her chance to strike. His fingers curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. He could almost hear her voice dripping with venom, mocking him at every board meeting. She'd nearly destroyed him once he wouldn't let her win again. 7 years ago, he'd clawed his way back from nothing, sketching late into the night, negotiating deals with suppliers who'd lost faith in the Carter name. He'd done it alone, and he'd do this alone too if he had to, but the clock was ticking, and the weight of it pressed against his chest like a stone. Ethan turned to his laptop, pulling up the latest report from his PR team. The new collections campaign was solid, but his sharp instincts caught a flaw, a vague tagline that competitors could twist. He typed a quick reply, revise this and send it back in an hour. No excuses. Control was his lifeline, the one thing he could still trust. He wouldn't let a single detail slip. Not now, not when the world was watching. A buzz broke his focus. His phone lit up on the desk, a message from James Parker, his lawyer and the only friend he'd kept close after the fallout with Olivia. I found someone who can help. She'll be there in 10 minutes. Ethan frowned, tossing the phone down with a soft thud. Help? He didn't need charity or some half-baked fix. But James wasn't the type to waste his time. If he had a plan, it was worth a listen. Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze settling on the door, cold and unyielding. Whatever this solution was, it better be good. Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Ethan paced to the window again, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. He didn't want this a forced marriage, a stranger in his life. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he didn't need anyone. But deep down, beneath the armor, there was a flicker of something he'd never admit. Loneliness, a quiet ache for someone to stand beside him, not out of duty or greed, but because they saw the man behind the title. He shook his head, shoving the thought away. That was a fantasy, and he didn't have time for fantasies. A soft knock pulled him back to the room. "Come in," he called, his voice deep and dry, stripped of warmth. The door swung open and James stepped inside, his usual easy grin in place, but Ethan's eyes skipped past him, landing on the woman who followed. She wasn't what he'd expected. No designer heels, no polished smile, just a worn denim jacket, brown hair tied up in a messy ponytail, and a thick sketchbook clutched against her chest. Her face was bare, no trace of makeup, but her eyes bright, alive with a confidence that hit him like a jolt. She didn't belong in his world of luxury and power, and yet she stood there like she owned the space. "Ethan," James said, his voice tinged with excitement. "This is Mia Lawson, freelance designer and the one who's going to get you through this contract mess." Mia stepped forward, setting her sketchbook on his desk with a quiet thud, her movements sure, unfazed by the icy stare he leveled at her. "I can help you, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clear, steady. "I know what's at stake, and I know how to make it work." Ethan tilted his head, sizing her up. A freelance designer? She looked more like an artist from some downtown loft than a savior for his empire. But those eyes, they locked onto his, unflinching, and for a moment he couldn't look away. There was something there, something he couldn't name. Not yet. "An advantage, huh?" he said, his tone cold, testing her. "What exactly do you think you know about my situation?" Mia didn't blink. "I know you need a wife to keep your company," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "And I know how to make it real enough to fool everyone." She paused, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to trust me yet. Just give me a chance." Ethan glanced at James, then back at her. His walls were still up, but that flicker of loneliness stirred again, uninvited. Maybe this was a game he didn't want to play, or maybe, just maybe, it was one he couldn't avoid. Ethan Carter stood in the dimly lit showroom of Carter Designs, his arms crossed, his green eyes fixed on the woman who'd just walked through his door. Mia Lawson. She didn't look like anyone who'd ever stepped into his world before. No sleek blazer, no polished heels clicking against the marble floor. Just a faded denim jacket, scuffed sneakers, and a brown ponytail that swung slightly as she moved. In her arms, she carried a thick sketchbook, its edges frayed like it had been her companion through 1,000 late nights. She set it down on his desk with a quiet confidence, meeting his gaze without a hint of hesitation. James Parker, his lawyer and friend, clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder, breaking the silence. "Ethan, meet Mia Lawson. She's a freelance designer, and trust me, she's the answer to your contract problem." James's voice carried that familiar optimism, but Ethan barely heard him. His attention was locked on Mia, on the way she stood there, unassuming yet unshaken, like she didn't care that she was facing the CEO of one of New York's biggest fashion houses. Mia took a step closer, her voice cutting through the tension. "I can help you, Mr. Carter. I know your situation, and I know how to turn it into something no one will question." Her words were steady, her eyes bright with a spark that made Ethan pause. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny, didn't shrink from the cold edge in his stare. Instead, she held her ground, and that alone was enough to make him curious. He tilted his head, his tone sharp but measured. "You know my situation? Enlighten me then. What exactly do you think you can do that I can't?" He wasn't used to people presuming they could solve his problems. For 7 years, he'd handled everything alone, rebuilt his company, fought off vultures like Olivia Hayes, kept his heart under lock and key, and now this stranger thought she could step in and fix it? Mia didn't back down. "I know you need someone to play your wife," she said simply. "To keep your shares, to stop Olivia Hayes from taking what's yours. I can make it look real not just to the press, but to your shareholders, your board, everyone. I'm good at creating stories, and I can help you tell yours." She paused, then added with a faint, knowing smile, "You don't have to believe me yet. Just try me." Ethan's eyes narrowed, searching her face for a crack, a hint of deceit. But all he saw was that quiet strength, those bright eyes that seemed to see right through his walls. Inside, his mind churned. What did she want? Money? A foothold in his world? People didn't offer help like this without an angle. And yet, there was something about her, something that tugged at a part of him he'd long buried. He pushed the feeling aside, keeping his voice icy. "An advantage, huh? Let's say I agree. This is a transaction. You do your job, I pay you, and no one gets into my personal life. Clear?" Mia nodded, unfazed. "Clear, Mr. Carter." Her gaze stayed steady, and for a moment the air between them thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. Ethan broke it first, turning to James. "Where'd you find her?" James shrugged, his grin widening. "She's good, Ethan. Hear her out." Ethan exhaled sharply, leaning back against his desk, his arms still crossed. He wasn't ready to let his guard down, but he'd give her a chance, if only to see what she could do. "Well," he asked suddenly, his voice dropping lower, laced with curiosity, "why do you want to do this?" He wasn't used to people stepping into his mess without a clear motive. Oh, was it fame, power, something else? Mia hesitated just for a second, and Ethan caught it, a flicker of something in her eyes, a shadow that vanished as quickly as it came. "I have my reasons," she said, her tone soft but firm. She didn't elaborate, and that silence hung between them, heavy with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Ethan frowned, an odd feeling creeping into his chest. She was hiding something, but he didn't have time to dig. If she could deliver, he'd take it for now. "All right," he said, his voice dry. "Where do you start?" Mia's lips curved into a small smile, and she reached for her sketchbook, pulling out her phone with the same quiet decisiveness. "Right now," she said. Her fingers moved fast, creating an Instagram account under the name Ethan and Mia. She scrolled through her phone, found an old photo of Ethan from last year's Fashion Week, a candid shot of him in a black suit, staring off into the distance, and edited it with a subtle trick. A faint silhouette of a woman appeared beside him, just blurry enough to spark curiosity. She typed a caption, "Love is the greatest inspiration." Then she turned the screen toward him. "First step is media coverage. We need them to believe this before the shareholders start digging." Ethan raised an eyebrow, glancing at the phone. Within seconds, the post was racking up likes, comments popping up like wildfire. The hashtag Carter Power couple started to trend. He couldn't deny it, she was fast. "You're quick," he said, his tone grudgingly impressed, though he masked it with a smirk. "But this isn't enough. The fashion world doesn't fall for cheap tricks, and neither do my shareholders." "I know," Mia replied, her confidence unshaken. "That's why I've got a story. We met at a small gallery opening in Brooklyn. I was showing my designs, and you couldn't take your eyes off them, or me. Simple, but it works. I'll send a press release tomorrow morning." She lowered her gaze to her sketchbook, flipping it open to adjust a design, her pencil moving with swift, precise strokes. She worked like it was second nature, like pressure was just another layer of air she breathed. Ethan watched her, the soft showroom lights catching the strands of her hair, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek. She wasn't flashy, wasn't trying to impress him with charm or seduction, but there was a fire in her, a quiet brilliance that made his pulse tick up a notch. He'd spent 7 years reading people, spotting lies in their smiles, their gestures. Mia wasn't lying, not yet, but she was holding something back, and that gnawed at him. "Where'd you work before this?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence, suspicion threading through it. Mia looked up, pausing for a heartbeat. "I'm freelance," she said simply. "Worked with small brands, nothing big." Ethan smirked, unconvinced. "Freelance, huh? You handle media like a pro. You're no rookie." She gave a small smile, not rising to the bait, and went back to her sketch. Ethan stepped closer, his shadow falling over her work. "You're good at this," he said, almost to himself, "but I don't trust easy. Don't think I'll let my guard down, just because you've got a quick hand." Mia glanced up, her eyes meeting his again, soft but unflinching. "I don't expect you to," she said quietly. "Not yet." Ethan turned away, walking to the window, the city lights stretching out below. His chest tightened, a mix of doubt and something warmer, something he didn't want to name. She was unlike anyone he'd met. Not Olivia, not anyone. And for the first time in years, he felt the pull to look a little closer. The New York skyline faded into a sea of twinkling lights as night settled over the city, but inside the Carter Designs showroom, time seemed to stand still. Ethan Carter sat at a long table strewn with fabric swatches and sketches, his sleeves rolled up, his sharp green eyes scanning every detail of the upcoming holiday collection. Around him, his design team scrambled, heads bent over their work, the air thick with tension. Hours earlier, they'd discovered a flaw: the stitching on the signature wool coats unraveled under stress. A small mistake that could unravel his brand's reputation. Ethan's voice had sliced through the room then, deep and unyielding. "We don't have time to redo every piece. Recheck the entire batch in 48 hours. Bring in extra hands if you have to. Not one coat leaves this building with that defect." "Understood." No one argued. They knew Ethan didn't tolerate excuses. 7 years ago, he'd pulled Carter Designs from the brink of ruin with nothing but talent and a refusal to bend. He wasn't about to let anyone, not his team, not Olivia Hayes, tarnish what he'd built. As the designers scattered to follow his orders, Ethan rubbed his temple, a flicker of exhaustion crossing his face before he buried it. Control was his armor, and he wore it well. Days later, the tension followed him to the launch event at a chic Manhattan venue. Cameras flashed as he took the stage, his voice steady as he unveiled a new line of handbags. But mid-speech, a PR assistant rushed up, whispering, "Sir, the speech, it's missing the ending." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could react, Mia Lawson stepped from the wings, holding a fresh sheet of paper. "Use this," she said, her voice soft but firm. He glanced at it. The words were sharper, the closing line simple yet striking. "Every bag tells a story, and we craft ours with heart." He looked at her, standing there in her denim jacket among a sea of tailored suits, and murmured, "You're fast." She just smiled, and he delivered the speech with a charm that left the crowd cheering. Later, Carter Power couple trended online thanks to a post Mia had slipped into the PR queue the night before. She was smart, Ethan thought, but he didn't need to lean on anyone. Still, a quiet part of him couldn't stop noticing her, the way she moved, the way she saw things he missed. A few nights later, he was back in the showroom, alone with a mountain of sketches for the next collection. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw as he worked. He hated going home to his sprawling penthouse, where the silence echoed too loud, the loneliness too sharp. Here, surrounded by designs, he could breathe. The door creaked open, and Mia stepped in, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. Ethan looked up, frowning. "Why are you still here? It's late." She set the cup down in front of him, her voice gentle. "I saw the lights on. You worked too hard. Thought you could use this." Her gaze drifted to the sketch. He held a handbag with a sleek strap. She pointed at it. "That clasp, it's too sharp. It'll cut the leather over time. Try a hidden hinge, it's stronger, cleaner." Ethan followed her finger, studying the design. She was right. His team had missed it, but she hadn't. His brow furrowed, a grudging respect flickering in his chest. "You know design," he said, not quite a question. Mia smiled faintly, pulling a chair over but leaving a careful distance between them. "I taught myself," she said, her tone soft but confident. "I like figuring things out. Plus, I've seen this mistake before in an old rival's line. You don't want to repeat it." He watched her, the way her hands moved as she spoke, steady and sure. She wasn't showing off, wasn't trying to prove anything. She just cared, and that threw him off balance. "All right," he said, his voice still firm but softer at the edges. "Fix it with me." Mia nodded, sliding her chair closer, and they leaned over the sketch together. Their pencils danced across the paper, lines blending as they refined the design. The showroom lights bathed them in a quiet warmth, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same pencil, and Ethan froze. Her fingertips were warm against his, a jolt running through him like a current. His heart skipped, unbidden, and he looked up, catching her gaze. Her eyes were steady, soft, unguarded, and something in them made his throat tighten. "You're not sleeping," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be, masking the strange ache rising inside him. Mia smiled, her eyes shimmering under the dim light. "I wanted to stay," she said quietly, "to look at the designs with you." Her words hung there, simple but heavy, like a secret meant just for him. Ethan didn't reply, just held her gaze a moment longer before turning back to the sketch. But then it happened, a rare, fleeting curve of his lips, a smile so small he didn't even notice it. For a heartbeat, the walls he'd built felt thinner. They worked into the early hours, the city outside fading to a hush. Mia's head eventually dipped, exhaustion winning, and she dozed off at the table, her cheek resting on her arm. Ethan set his pencil down, watching her. Her brown hair fell over her face, her breathing slow and peaceful, almost fragile. He stood, slipping off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering as he adjusted it. She didn't stir, and he was glad for it. He didn't want her to see the way his expression softened, the way a forgotten warmth spread through his chest. The next morning, a light rain tapped against the showroom windows as they stepped outside together. Ethan held an umbrella, shielding Mia from the drizzle. She slipped on the wet pavement, a small gasp escaping her, and his reflexes kicked in. He caught her wrist, pulling her close, his voice low with concern. "Careful, I can't lose my best asset." Mia's cheeks flushed, her eyes lifting to his, and her heart thudded loud enough she was sure he'd hear it. His hand stayed on hers, warm and steady, and for a moment, the rain blurred the world around them, leaving just the two of them under that small circle of shelter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly drowned in the patter of rain. Ethan heard it, though, and he didn't let go right away. He guided her forward, his grip firm, his mind spinning with something he couldn't name. Later, as he sat in his office, an email from Mia popped up, a supply order she'd sent at midnight, flagged as confidential. Doubt flickered, memories of Olivia's secret calls clawing at him, but then he glanced at his hand, still feeling the echo of her touch in the rain, and a different thought took hold. She's not Olivia, he told himself, pushing the suspicion down. Not her. That night, alone on the showroom balcony, Ethan watched the rain streak across the city. Mia's face flashed in his mind, the way she'd fixed his speech, the way she'd stayed with him through the quiet hours, the way her presence felt like a light he hadn't known he needed. "I'm not used to this," he murmured, gripping the railing, "but I don't hate it." Deep down, something was shifting, something he wasn't ready to admit, but couldn't ignore. The hum of a private jet faded as Ethan Carter and Mia Lawson touched down in Los Angeles, the city sprawling beneath a golden afternoon sky. Ethan had insisted on the trip. A key supplier had balked at delivering cashmere for Carter Design's winter collection, threatening deadlines Ethan refused to miss. He could have sent his procurement team, but Ethan didn't trust anyone else to handle it, not when his company hung in the balance, and he'd asked Mia to come. "You understand design," he'd said on the plane, his voice calm but firm. "I need your eyes." She'd nodded, and now here they were, stepping into the warm California air together. The meeting at a textile factory on the edge of LA was a battle of wills. Ethan stood tall in front of the supplier's director, his tone cold and cutting. "If you can't deliver, I'll find someone who can, and I'll make sure no one in this industry touches you again. Meet the deadline, and Carter Design signs a long-term deal. Your call." His authority was undeniable, and the director caved, promising the shipment by week's end. Mia watched from the sidelines, a flicker of admiration in her eyes as Ethan turned to her, tossing a rare, self-satisfied glance. "It's done," he said, and she smiled, a quiet pride blooming in her chest. After the meeting, instead of rushing back to the airport, Ethan surprised her. "Come with me," he said, leading her to Santa Monica Pier. The sun dipped low, painting the ocean in hues of orange and pink, the waves crashing softly against the shore. They walked side by side, the salty breeze tugging at Mia's hair. Ethan stopped at a vendor's cart, buying a single red rose without a word. He turned to her, his fingers brushing her cheek as he tucked the flower behind her ear. "It suits you," he murmured, his voice low and warm, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen it. Mia touched the rose, her cheeks turning pink, a shy smile breaking through. "You're more romantic than I thought," she said, and for once, Ethan didn't argue. A light drizzle started to fall, and Ethan opened an umbrella, pulling her closer beneath it. Their shoulders brushed as they walked, the rain tapping a gentle rhythm around them. He led her to a small cafe by the boardwalk, its golden light spilling onto the wet pavement. They sat across from each other, hands wrapped around steaming cups of coffee, the heat seeping into their fingers. Ethan studied her through the steam, his voice deep and curious. "When did you fall in love with fashion?" Mia's smile faded into something softer, her eyes drifting to a memory she rarely shared. "Since I was little," she began, her voice quiet. "But I didn't have anything to chase it with. My mom and we were homeless for years, sleeping on park benches, shivering through cold nights. She'd pick through trash just to scrape together a few dollars." Her voice trembled, and she swallowed hard. One day, she collapsed right there in the park, holding me, starving, whispering she was sorry she couldn't do more. I was 15, ready to drop out of school to work, but no one would hire me. Then someone changed everything. She paused, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. A man saw her fall. He called an ambulance, got her a job as a shop assistant later. Because of him, she could put me through college. That's when fashion became my way to give back. She didn't say who the man was, and Ethan didn't press, but he watched her closely, his coffee forgotten. Then he spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "I had passion once, too. Lost it when someone I trusted took it all away." Mia tilted her head, waiting. Ethan took a slow breath, like he was unlocking a door he'd bolted shut years ago. "Olivia?" he said finally, his hands tightening around his mug. "She was my world 7 years ago. I let her into my designs, my spring-summer line. Thought we'd build something together. Then she stole it, sold it to a competitor right before the launch." His voice dropped, dark and heavy. My dad couldn't take it. The scandal hit him hard. He had a stroke and didn't make it. I lost him, lost everything I believed in. After that, I swore I'd never let anyone in again. Silence settled between them, thick with shared pain. Then Mia reached out, her fingers resting lightly on his hand, warm and steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with empathy. "But you're not alone, Ethan. I'm here. I won't hurt you." She squeezed his hand, her touch gentle but firm, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection neither had planned for. They sat there, watching rain streak down the cafe window, the quiet space filling with a fragile trust. That night, back at their hotel, Ethan reviewed files in his room when he overheard Mia through the thin walls. Her voice was a hushed whisper on the phone. "Hide the source. Don't let him find out." Ethan froze, his pen slipping from his hand. Doubt sliced through him, sharp and familiar, dragging up memories of Olivia's late-night calls before she'd stabbed him in the back. His pulse raced, his mind spinning. Was Mia playing him too? But then he remembered her, the way she'd leaned into him under the umbrella, the honesty in her eyes when she'd told him about her mom, the softness of her smile when he'd given her that rose. His fingers brushed his wrist, still feeling the warmth of her touch from earlier. "She's not Olivia," he told himself, shoving the suspicion down, but it lingered, a shadow he couldn't fully shake, warring with something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. Later, he stepped onto the hotel balcony, the LA skyline glittering against the night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. Mia's words echoed in his head. "I'm here. I won't hurt you," and her face flashed behind his eyes, bright and unguarded. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "I don't know what this is," he muttered to the empty night, "but I can't stop thinking about her." Back in her room, Mia sat on the edge of her bed, the red rose in her hands. She twirled it between her fingers, her heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. She'd meant every word she'd said to him, but there was more to her story, more she hadn't told him. Not yet. She'd come into his life to help him, to repay a debt from years ago, but now it was more than that. She was falling for him, the way he looked at her like she was something precious, the way his voice softened when he said her name. She pressed the rose to her chest, closing her eyes. "I didn't expect this," she whispered, "but I don't want to let it go." Across the hall, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her touch lingered on his skin, her voice in his ears. For 7 years, he'd lived behind walls, safe in his solitude. But Mia, she was breaking through piece by piece, and he didn't know how to stop it, didn't know if he wanted to. The rose he'd given her flashed in his mind, a splash of red against the gray of his world, and a quiet truth settled in his chest. He was starting to care too much to turn back now. Morning broke over New York with a heavy gray fog, cloaking the city in a hush that felt like secrets waiting to spill. Inside the towering office of Carter Designs, Ethan Carter sat motionless at his desk, his bloodshot eyes locked on his laptop screen. He hadn't slept, hadn't moved since the email hit his inbox hours ago. His hands gripped the desk's edge, knuckles white, as he stared at the headline from an Instagram post by Olivia Hayes's company, Hayes Luxe. "Did Carter Designs steal our designs? The truth is coming." Below it, a photo showed a winter coat from his latest collection, next to an almost identical one from Hayes Luxe. The resemblance was too perfect, too deliberate. Ethan's breath came hard and fast. This wasn't just a jab at his reputation, something he could shrug off with a press conference. This was an attack on his shareholders, who'd been blowing up his phone all night with demands for answers. He knew Olivia was behind it. She'd taunted him before, but now she'd gone for the jugular, striking at the empire he'd rebuilt from nothing after her betrayal 7 years ago. And then came her email. The subject line a dagger. "Ask your fake wife." He clicked it, his blood turning to ice as he read. "Ethan, you're a fool to trust her. Mia Lawson isn't who you think. Ask her what she's hiding and why she got close to you. Here's proof. Don't be fooled again like you were with me." Attached were damning pieces, a grainy photo of Mia at Fashion Week, phone in hand, her face shadowed and tense, a screenshot of a text supposedly from her to, "Oh, the winter collection's ready to send, he doesn't suspect a thing." And then a memory hit him from LA, her whispered phone call, hide the source, don't let him find out. Back then he'd buried his doubts under the warmth of her touch, the softness of her voice by the ocean. But now, with Olivia's words staring back at him, it all clicked into a picture he couldn't unsee. Mia, a spy? The thought cut him deeper than anything Olivia had ever done. His chest heaved, rage crashing against a pain he hadn't felt in years. He'd let her in late nights sketching together, her hand in his under the rain, the rose he'd pressed into her hair in LA. He'd loved her, and now he feared she'd played him for a fool. "Where is she?" he growled, his voice thundering through the empty office. An assistant peeked in, stammering, "Miss Lawson's in the showroom, sir." Ethan shoved his chair back, the screech of metal on tile sharp as a blade, and stormed out, his footsteps echoing with fury. The showroom lights blazed, but the air was heavy with the storm brewing inside him. He slammed the door open, and there she was, Mia, sitting at the design table, sketching a dress with that same quiet focus he'd once admired. She looked up at the sound, a soft smile lighting her face. "You're back early," she said, her voice warm, oblivious to the fire in his eyes. "I was just about to send you this." She didn't finish. Ethan strode forward, slamming his laptop onto the table, the thud ringing out like a gunshot. The screen glowed with Olivia's email, the photos, the texts. "Explain this," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage, his eyes blazing. "You're Olivia's spy, aren't you? I let you in, I loved you, and you stabbed me in the back." Mia's pencil dropped, her eyes widening as she glanced from him to the screen. Her hands trembled and she shot to her feet. No, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Ethan cut her off, his voice cold and raw. "You think I'm an idiot? This is your message to Olivia, the collection's ready to send. And that call in LA, telling someone to hide something because he'll find out? That was me, wasn't it? What game are you playing, Mia?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, Ethan, I swear I didn't do this," she cried, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out only to freeze under his glare. "You have to believe me. I didn't betray you." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed steady, pleading. Ethan turned away, unable to face those tears, his tone bitter. "Didn't do anything wrong? Then explain this sneaking around, texting my enemy, sabotaging everything I built. I was a fool to trust you, a fool to think you were different from her." His hand slammed the table, a coffee mug shattering on the floor, shards scattering like his trust. "You're worse than Olivia," he spat, the words cutting deeper than he meant. Mia's breath hitched, desperation breaking through. "Ethan, please, listen to me," she begged, calling him by his name for the first time, her voice raw. "Those messages aren't mine. I don't know how Olivia got them. That call in LA, it wasn't what you think. Please, you have to believe me." "Enough," he roared, yanking his hand from her reach. "I don't want another word from you. I trusted you, let you in, and now I feel like a damn idiot. Get out before I call security." His chest heaved, his fingers aching from gripping the table. He forced himself not to look at her, not to see the pain in those eyes that had melted him in LA. It hurt too much, cut too deep. Maya stood frozen, tears dripping onto the marble floor, her shoulders trembling. She didn't speak, didn't fight back. She just turned, her steps hollow, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Ethan alone in a silence that choked him. He collapsed into a chair, hands gripping his head, and for the first time in 7 years, tears burned his eyes. He'd loved her more than he'd admitted, even to himself. He'd pushed her away with words he couldn't take back, and now she was gone. The showroom felt colder, emptier, the sketches on the table mocking him with her handwriting in the margins. He replayed every moment, the way she'd brought him coffee, the way her laugh had softened his edges, the way she'd looked at him like he was more than a title. Had he been wrong? The doubt gnawed at him, but it was drowned by the ache in his chest. He'd built walls to keep out pain, but Mia had slipped through, and losing her hurt worse than anything Olivia had ever done. Outside, Mia stumbled into the fog, her denim jacket soaked with rain she didn't feel. She clutched her sketchbook, her sobs swallowed by the city's hum. She'd lost him, not just the man she'd come to save, but the one she'd fallen for, the one who'd made her believe in something more. The rose from LA was still in her bag, its petals crushed, and she pressed a hand to her heart, whispering, "I didn't want to hurt you," but he was gone, and the weight of that broke her in ways she hadn't expected. The fog still clung to New York streets as afternoon rolled in, but inside Carter Design's virtual boardroom, the air burned with tension. Ethan Carter sat before a massive screen, his sharp green eyes locked on the faces of his shareholders, dozens of them staring back through Zoom. He wore a black suit, exuding a cold authority, but beneath it, his heart churned with rage, regret, and a love he could no longer deny. Hours earlier, after throwing Mia out with words that still stung his tongue, James Parker had uncovered a piece of the truth. Mia wasn't a spy. She was the daughter of Henry Grayson, the late fashion mogul, and she'd been helping him all along. But Ethan knew saving his company and winning her back would take more than facts. It would take everything he had. "Thank you for joining this emergency meeting," he began, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the digital hum. "Rumors have shaken your trust, but today, I'll set it right." He leaned forward, sharing his screen. Emails from Hayes Lux flashed up, documents he'd dug up himself that morning, with his IT team's help, proof of Olivia's lies. "This," he said coolly, "is Olivia Hayes instructing her PR team to spread rumors on Instagram. And this is her payment to a designer to copy our collection before its release." The screen split, and Olivia appeared, her smirk faltering. "Ethan, you're pathetic," she purred, her voice trembling. "Mia Lawson was your spy. She sent me the designs. What do you say to that?" Before Ethan could respond, a new window popped up. Mia Lawson joined the call, her face framed by the screen, her eyes red but resolute. Ethan's breath caught. She'd come back, after everything. Mia's gaze fixed on Olivia, not him. "You called me a spy," she said, her voice calm but sharp. She clicked her screen, evidence piling up. "These are your messages to a hacker, faking texts between us. This is your invoice for copying the collection. And this," her voice steadied as tears slipped down her cheeks, "is you plotting the rumor." Gasps erupted from the shareholders. Olivia's face paled, her voice cracking. "You're lying." "I do," Ethan cut in, his tone low and lethal. "I verified it all. The emails, the payments, the recording. It's over, Olivia." A senior shareholder spoke up. "I move to remove Olivia Hayes from the board." The vote was swift, and Olivia's scream faded as her mic was muted. The meeting ended, Olivia's shares stripped, a lawsuit looming. Ethan sat back, hands trembling, and turned to James. "Where is she?" James smirked. "A cafe near Central Park. I got her on the call, but you've got to go to her yourself." Ethan didn't hesitate. Central Park glowed with late afternoon sun, the trees casting long shadows. Rain clouds gathered, heavy and dark. He found Mia on a bench by the lake, cradling a cold coffee, her denim jacket damp. She looked small, fragile, and his heart broke all over again. "Mia," he called softly, stepping closer. She looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes before she dropped them. "I didn't think you'd come," she murmured, barely audible. Ethan didn't sit. He dropped to one knee before her, taking her hands in his. His eyes burned with a tenderness she hadn't seen before. "I love you," he said, his voice raw. "I don't know when it started, maybe in LA when you leaned on me by the ocean, maybe in the rain when you made me laugh. For years, I locked myself away after Olivia, swore I'd never feel again. I was wrong to doubt you, wrong to hurt you." He swallowed hard. Forgive me, Mia. Stay with me, not for a contract, but because I need you. Tears spilled down Mia's cheeks, her smile breaking through. Ethan, she whispered, her voice cracking. I never wanted to leave. She fell into his arms, sobbing into his shoulder as rain began to fall, misting around them. Ethan pulled her up, holding her tight, and kissed her, a fierce, desperate kiss that erased every doubt, every mistake. The rain soaked them, but they didn't move, clinging to each other like the world could wait. He pulled out his phone, starting an Instagram Live on Carter Design's account. She's everything to me, he said, his eyes locked on Mia, the stream exploding with likes. That night, in his penthouse overlooking the Hudson, they sat on the sofa, fingers entwined, rain tapping the glass. Ethan gazed at her, guilt roughening his voice. I said awful things this morning, called you a traitor, said I feared you. I doubted you because I was scared I'd be broken again like with Olivia. I'm sorry, Mia. She rested a hand on his cheek, her touch warm. I don't blame you, she whispered. I know your pain, but I stayed because I wanted to heal you. She paused, then took a breath. I'm Henry Grayson's daughter. I built Grayson Threads from his legacy. I turned down a deal in Milan to be here because you're my light, Ethan. She pulled out a faded photo, her mother, Margaret Lawson, in a Carter Designs uniform, smiling faintly. 10 years ago, we were starving in a park. Mom collapsed in the rain, holding me, apologizing. A man saved us, called an ambulance, got her a job here. That man was you. Ethan froze, his mind racing back to that night. A frail woman, a scared girl clutching her hand. His vision blurred, and he pulled Mia close, his voice breaking. I didn't know it was you. I love you, Mia, and I'll never let you go again. He kissed her, deep and fierce, pouring in every regret, every promise. Your mom would be proud you found me, he whispered against her lips. Mia smiled through tears, resting her forehead on his. Should be proud I chose you. A week later, under Central Park's green canopy, they married. Mia walked to him in a simple white dress, a red rose in her hair, echoing L.A. Ethan waited in a white shirt and gray vest, his eyes never leaving her. James officiated, grinning. Ethan, do you promise to love and protect Mia forever? I do, Ethan said, his voice steady. Mia, do you? I do, she replied, her eyes shining. They exchanged rings, and as James said, kiss the bride. Ethan pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that sealed their vows. Rain fell, soft and blessing, and they let it soak them, laughing through it. A year later, Carter Grayson, their merged empire, celebrated its first anniversary. The showroom glowed, customers lining up for the new collection. Ethan found Mia adjusting a dress, wrapped his arms around her, and murmured, From doubt you gave me forever. She turned, pressing a hand to his chest. From fear you gave me a home. They kissed, slow and deep under the showroom lights, applause breaking out around them. On the balcony, New York sparkled below, and Ethan held her close, whispering, I won't promise you the world, Mia, but I promise you mine. She leaned into him, her voice soft, and I'll stay in it forever. Their hands laced together, hearts steady, the city a silent witness to a love that had conquered all. And there you have it, the story of Ethan and Mia, a tale of two hearts finding each other against all odds. From the cold streets of New York to the warm shores of L.A., from a contract born of necessity to a love that rewrote their lives, they showed us something beautiful. Love isn't always easy. It's messy, it's fragile, it's full of doubts and fears, but when it's real, when it's worth fighting for, it can heal even the deepest wounds. Ethan learned to trust again. Mia found her home, and together, they built something stronger than either could have dreamed alone. What did you think of their journey? Did it make your heart ache when Ethan pushed Mia away, only to realize she was his everything? Did you feel the rain on your skin when they kissed in Central Park, sealing a promise that nothing could break? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. Tell me your favorite moment, or maybe how this story reminded you of a love in your own life. Every comment means the world to us here at Emma's Stories. It's what keeps these tales alive. If Ethan and Mia's love touched you, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a little way to say this story mattered. Share it with a friend who needs a dose of romance or someone who believes in second chances. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Emma's Stories. We're a community that celebrates love in all its forms, the quiet moments, the wild leaps, the forever promises. Let's keep spreading warmth and hope, one story at a time. Until next time, keep believing in love, and I'll see you in the next tale. Take care, dreamers.